In America, a split decision it is. For the Democrats, it's restoring checks and balances. For Trump and the Republicans, a reality check, but not a disaster. That's just two of how the U.S. midterm elections have been described. Now, what lies ahead for America's bilateral relations and the next 2 years of a Trump presidency? Let's reach out to political correspondent Thomas Sparrow, who is with our partner DW in Berlin. Thomas, it's good to see you. Now, first tell us, what has been the reaction in Germany and indeed Europe to the American midterm election results?
Well, essentially, it depends who you ask. Some of the so-called traditional parties, for example, the conservatives or the social democrats here have stressed that the relationship to the United States remains a key pillar for Germany and indeed for Europe, even though obviously they have admitted in the past, and they did so again today, that some elements of that relationship have to be reassessed or recalibrated, because we've discussed it here before, Gifty. Obviously, the US and the EU do not see eye to eye now when it comes to many of Donald Trump's foreign policy decisions like climate or Iran or NATO, and there are a few others as well. On the other hand, for example, if you ask the far-right AfD, that's the third party, the third biggest party here in the parliament, they congratulated Donald Trump on his victory in the Senate, and they said that the fact that the Democrats hadn't been able to get a better result was because of what they described as Donald Trump's successful policy on economics and immigration. So you can see that there are different views here in Germany as to what the results of the midterms in the US mean, not only internally for the US, but also for the bilateral transatlantic relationship.
Certainly. So what then does a Republican Senate and a Democrat House of Representatives mean for US-EU relations, especially in the wake of reinstatement of sanctions on Iran, for example, and the migrant crisis that indeed the entire world is facing?
Well, you mentioned the key words, that idea of control, of checks and balances. The fact that the Democrats now will control the House means that they will block or they can limit some of Donald Trump's domestic policies. Now, the fears when they do that is that that could mean that Donald Trump focuses even more on his foreign policy priorities, and that's a concern, or it could be a concern for Europe, because as I've just mentioned, the EU and the US do not see eye to eye when it comes to the US's foreign policy. So on the one hand, obviously, many in Europe find it important that there are these checks and balances, that Donald Trump cannot simply act because of the fact that that Congress is controlled completely by the Republicans, as was the case previously. The fact that now, obviously, the Democrats can carry out those controls is viewed here in a positive light. At the same time, there is a certain concern that Donald Trump could become even more assertive when it comes to foreign policy, and that by doing so, that could affect even more the relationship between Europe and the United States. And that's why you hear from different politicians today that the response to Donald Trump's policy of America first has to be Europe united, in the words of Heiko Maas, Germany's foreign minister, stressing essentially that Europe has to get its act together when it comes to foreign policy and become stronger in foreign policy, so that if Donald Trump indeed becomes more assertive himself, then Europe can also react accordingly.
Interesting. What about America's relationship with Africa? Do you think that any change is to be expected for the next 2 years left for Donald Trump, at least for the first term?
Well, obviously, it's still too early to see if there are any concrete measures that will change. And in fact, that applies also for the US-European relationship. But I do think that you can understand it in a more broader perspective. And I've just explained, for example, how that fact that Donald Trump could start to focus much more on his foreign policy priorities, and that obviously could also impact Africa as well. But as far as concrete policies, I think it's still too early to say. We'll have to see how he himself, how the Republicans also adapt to these new circumstances in the United States, and then how accordingly, for example, here European leaders react, or African leaders react to how Donald Trump and the Republicans start to work under these new circumstances in the US Congress.
Well, interesting, but looks like more interesting times ahead for the political dynamics of the United States of America. Thomas, thank you so much for those updates and the analysis that you've helped us with. Thomas Sparrow is political correspondent with our partners DW, joining us all the way in Berlin here on the Pulse.